Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I leaned against the counter, the soft hum of the coffee machine filling the quiet kitchen. It was early, too early for me to be awake, but I hadn't slept well in weeks. I used to love the silence of mornings like this, the calm before the day started. Now it felt different. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was uneasy, a void filled with thoughts I couldn't quite place. Sarah wasn't home. She'd left before dawn, another late-night work emergency. I tried not to think about it, tried not to let the creeping doubt worm its way into my head, but it was becoming harder to ignore. Something had shifted between us. I could feel it, small, almost imperceptible changes that no one else would notice. But I did. I noticed everything. The smell of fresh coffee broke through my thoughts, but even that didn't settle me. I poured a cup, black, and sat down at the table, staring into the dark liquid. I used to find comfort in these routines. Sarah and I would sit here together, sipping our coffee, talking about nothing and everything. Now, even when she was home, there was this distance between us, a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. My fingers tapped against the mug as I glanced at the clock. 6:45 a.m. Sarah wouldn't be home for hours. She never was anymore. She'd come in late, offer some vague excuse about meetings running over, and collapse into bed without so much as a word. It used to bother me. Now it felt like a pattern I couldn't change. I sighed, leaning back in my chair, staring out the window. The world outside looked the same, perfect, orderly, but inside, everything felt off-kilter. Our marriage had always been solid. We'd been together for almost a decade. No kids, by choice. We didn't need them. At least that's what we told ourselves. We had each other, or at least, we used to. The bed was cold these days, her body pulling away from mine, just out of reach. At first, I told myself it was stress. Her job was demanding, marketing director at a big firm downtown. She'd been climbing the corporate ladder for years, sacrificing nights, weekends, even vacations. I admired her for it, supported her drive. But now, her ambition felt like a wall between us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind it. I ran a hand over my face, trying to dispel the tension building in my chest. Stop overthinking, I told myself. This was just a phase, a rough patch. Every couple goes through them. But no matter how many times I repeated the words in my head, I couldn't quiet the nagging voice that said, this wasn't just a phase. This was different. This was something else. I took a sip of coffee, my thoughts spiraling back to the little things, the late nights, the coldness in her touch, the way she always kept her phone face down now, something she never used to do. There had been a time when I would have laughed at myself for even thinking it, but now I couldn't ignore it. She was hiding something. I knew it. I heard the front door creak open and my pulse quickened. I glanced at the clock again, 7 o'clock a.m. Sarah wouldn't be back this early, but it wasn't Sarah. It was just the wind, rattling through the gaps in the frame. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. What was happening to me? I used to be grounded, rational. Now, I felt like I was always on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I shook my head, standing up, walking toward the living room. The framed pictures on the wall caught my eye, images of Sarah and me, smiling, happy. There we were, on our honeymoon in Greece, her hair whipping in the wind, laughing as I tried to take a picture with my thumb over the lens. And there, at our 5-year anniversary dinner, candles flickering between us, her hand resting on mine, eyes full of love and certainty. But those pictures felt like relics of a life that no longer existed. I couldn't remember the last time she'd looked at me like that. I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts, lingering over Sarah's name. I thought about calling her, asking where she was, but what was the point? She'd tell me what she always did, work, meetings, clients. I didn't even know why I bothered pretending anymore. Instead, I flipped to my texts, the messages between us short, curt. Lately, they've been more about logistics than anything else. When are you home? Did you pick up groceries? Can you handle dinner tonight? I hadn't realized how transactional we'd become until now. The absence of emotion, of connection, was glaring. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed it sooner. I set the phone down, my hands shaking slightly. What was wrong with me? Why couldn't I just ask her, confront her about what I was feeling? But every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. Maybe because I was afraid of what she'd say. The day dragged on in a blur of meetings and emails, but my mind was somewhere else, circling the same thoughts over and over. By the time I got home, the house was still empty, dark, quiet. Sarah's absence felt heavier now, like a shadow looming over everything. I tried to ignore it, focus on dinner, something simple, a sandwich, chips, whatever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, that I was losing control. I didn't hear from her all night. When I finally crawled into bed, the sheets felt colder than ever. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the empty house settle around me, my mind replaying every moment of the last few weeks, every sign I'd missed, the way she'd stopped saying I love you before bed. The way she'd slip out of the house earlier and earlier, her scent still lingering in the air long after she was gone. I rolled over, reaching for her pillow, breathing in the faint traces of her perfume. For a moment, I closed my eyes, willing myself to believe that everything was fine. That we were fine. But deep down, I knew. I knew something was coming. It wasn't until the next morning that things finally came into focus. I was in the kitchen again, pouring my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, expecting a work email or maybe a text from Sarah, but instead it was a calendar alert. Anniversary 10 years. I stared at the words, the weight of them sinking in. I'd forgotten. We'd both forgotten. 10 years. We'd been together for a decade, and neither of us had even mentioned it. No dinner plans, no cards, no acknowledgement. It was like the day didn't matter. I felt something shift inside me then, a cold realization settling in. This wasn't just a rough patch. This wasn't something we could fix with a few conversations or a weekend away. Whatever we had, it was already broken. I leaned against the counter, the coffee in my hand forgotten. The last 10 years played out in my mind like a film reel, every moment flashing before me, each memory tinged with the realization that it hadn't been enough. I hadn't been enough. I glanced at my phone again, the notification still sitting there like a silent accusation. How could we have forgotten something so important? My chest tightened, anger bubbling up beneath the surface. Not at Sarah, but at myself. I'd let this happen. I'd let our marriage drift into something unrecognizable, and now it was too late to pull it back. I stared at the empty doorway, half expecting her to walk in and tell me it was all a mistake, that she hadn't forgotten, that she still cared. But the house remained silent. The truth was, she wasn't coming back, not really. Even if she walked through the door tomorrow, things would never be the same. I set the coffee down and stared at the phone, the weight of the realization sinking in. Sarah had already left. I just hadn't realized it yet. By the time the clock hit midnight, Sarah still wasn't home. Not a text, not a call, nothing. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. All I knew was that the unease I'd felt for weeks had solidified into something real, something I couldn't ignore any longer. The doubts were no longer just doubts. They were facts waiting to be uncovered, and I was going to find them. I couldn't sleep. The sheets felt like they were suffocating me, the silence of the house too loud in my ears. It was past midnight and Sarah still wasn't home. I didn't bother texting her. She wouldn't respond. My chest felt tight as I replayed the day over and over in my mind. That damn anniversary notification. 10 years, forgotten like it meant nothing. I'd let my anger simmer down into a cold, heavy weight in my gut, and I knew something was terribly wrong. This wasn't paranoia. I dragged myself out of bed and wandered into the kitchen, flipping on the light. The same routine, night after night, hoping she'd walk through the door like she used to. But she wouldn't. Not anymore. Her phone had buzzed earlier when she was getting dressed. She'd smiled at it, one of those real smiles, the kind she hadn't given me in months. I asked her what was so funny. She brushed me off. "Nothing," she said, slipping the phone into her bag like it was a reflex. I was a fool letting that slide. I wasn't going to keep doing that. I found myself in front of her laptop, sitting on the kitchen island. She never left it unlocked, always quick to close the lid when I came into the room. But tonight, she was in too much of a hurry. I stared at it, the cursor blinking like it was taunting me. Just a few clicks and I could find out. I'd know for sure. The thought made my palms sweat. I didn't want to be that guy, the kind of husband who snooped. But it had come to this, hadn't it? Something in the back of my mind warned me to stop, to put the laptop down and forget about it, but I couldn't. I opened her email first. Nothing. Everything looked normal. Work threads, spam, a few Amazon orders. She was careful, maybe too careful. I clicked over to her personal email. That's when I saw it. A hotel reservation. Downtown. The charge had hit the bank account yesterday. My heart sank. I scrolled further, my stomach turning as I realized this wasn't the first time. There were others. Quiet transactions that never raised a red flag before. A cocktail bar, a day spa. All on nights when she told me she was working late. I clicked out of her email, my pulse racing. I needed more. Proof. I found my phone and pulled up our joint bank account. My hands were shaking now, the numbers blurring as I scrolled through the transactions. Hotel charges, restaurants I'd never been to. Every line item was another punch to the gut. I could feel the air being sucked out of the room. I wasn't paranoid. I was right. I'd been right all along. I slammed the laptop shut, my breathing ragged. I wanted to punch something. Instead, I just stood there, staring at the dark screen, 1,000 thoughts racing through my head. Anger, humiliation, fear. It all swirled together, making me feel sick. But no, I wasn't going to fall apart. Not now. This wasn't the time for tears or begging for answers. I was going to do this the smart way, methodical. I needed to know everything before I confronted her. I wasn't about to let her twist this around on me. The anger sharpened into something colder, more focused. I'd get to the bottom of this. I grabbed my jacket and keys, not caring that it was the middle of the night. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to know where she was right now. I didn't bother leaving her a note. I drove through the city streets, my jaw clenched, the radio off. My mind was a storm, flashing with all the possible scenarios I might find. When I pulled up outside the hotel, I parked far enough away that I wouldn't be seen. The place was upscale, classy. The kind of place you'd go if you didn't want to be noticed. I checked the time, 2:30 a.m. There were only a few people milling around outside, most of them getting into cabs. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, scanning the entrance. I don't know how long I waited, 10 minutes, maybe 20, before I saw her. Sarah stepped out of the lobby looking like she didn't have a care in the world. She wasn't alone. He was with her. Tall, sharp suit, everything about him screamed money. They didn't even try to hide it. They laughed as they walked toward a black town car, her hand brushing his arm. His smile was confident, smug. I wanted to rip his throat out. I swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in my throat. This was it. The moment everything shattered. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I watched them get into the car together. Sarah was leaning into him, laughing like she didn't have a husband at home wondering where the hell she was. I stared at the car as it pulled away, my chest tight, my hands shaking. There was no need for confrontation tonight. I had all the proof I needed. I drove back home in a daze. The city lights blurred past me, but I barely noticed. My mind was locked on that image of her with him. How comfortable they looked together, how natural, as if this had been going on for a long time. When I got back, the house was still dark, empty. I stood in the doorway, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I hadn't realized I was crying until I felt the tears on my cheeks. But I wasn't crying for her. No, I was crying because something in me had snapped. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I knew, was gone. She wasn't the person I married. She wasn't coming back. I wasn't going to wait around like some fool, hoping she'd choose me over him. No, That wasn't how this was going to go. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, but the anger was louder. Anger that she'd lied. Anger that she'd let me sit at home every night, believing her bullshit stories about work while she was out with him. And anger at myself for letting it go on for so long. I wasn't going to confront her right away. I wasn't going to let her explain it all away with some lame excuses. I was smarter than that. I was patient. I could bide my time. I went back to the bank account records. I opened a notebook and started writing down dates, matching the transactions to the nights she'd said she was working late. I marked the hotel charges, the restaurants. It was all there, right in front of me, the timeline of her betrayal. I stared at the list for what felt like hours, my hands still trembling. This wasn't just some fling. This was calculated, planned. She'd made a fool of me for months, maybe longer. And now that I knew, there was no going back. But I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a scene, of me begging her for answers, for closure. No, I was going to turn the tables. I was going to make her pay for every single lie. I grabbed my phone and searched for a private investigator. If I was going to take her down, I needed everything. I needed to know how deep this went. I wasn't going to give her an inch to slip out of this, not Sarah, not her lover. I could barely stand to think about him, that smug, rich bastard. His face flashed in my mind again, the way he looked at her, the way she laughed with him, like they were the only two people in the world. He was the reason my marriage was crumbling. He was going to get what was coming to him too. The investigator called me back the next day. I didn't give him much, just the basics. Sarah's schedule, her usual haunts, a few places I suspected. I didn't even mention the name of the man yet. I wanted to keep that close to the chest for now. The PI was confident, too confident maybe, but I didn't care. I needed someone to help me confirm what I already knew. I couldn't let this be a mistake. I couldn't afford to be wrong. My mind was clear now. The uncertainty had hardened into something sharp, cold. I would see this through to the end. A few days later, the first set of photos came in. It wasn't hard for the PI to track her movements. She was careless. They all were, thinking they were untouchable. Sarah met him, Michael, I learned his name was, 3 nights that week. Restaurants, more hotel rooms. The pattern was undeniable. She was building her own life with him, a life where I didn't exist, a life where I was an afterthought. I stared at the photos long after the PI left, Sarah, smiling, Michael, his hand on her back, the two of them walking through the hotel lobby, oblivious to anyone who might see them. They weren't afraid of being caught. They didn't even care. That was what burned the most. They thought they were untouchable, but they weren't, not by a long shot. I spent the next few days in a haze, going through the motions at work, coming home to an empty house. Sarah's lies were now all I could think about. Every time she spoke, every time she laughed, I saw the truth behind her eyes. The anger was constant now, simmering just beneath the surface, but I kept it in check. I had to. I watched her, studied her, pieced together more of her little deceits. She still kept her phone face down, still smiled when she thought I wasn't looking. But now, I saw through all of it. The cracks in her facade were widening, and soon enough, it would all come crashing down. The thing was, I wasn't just planning on confronting her. That would be too easy, too obvious. No, I was going to make her feel what I felt. The loss, the betrayal, the emptiness. And Michael? He wasn't getting off easy either. His whole world was about to crumble. The seeds of revenge were planted. I didn't act right away. I could have thrown her out the second I saw those pictures, could have stormed into Michael's office and punched him in the face. But that wasn't enough. Not for what they'd done. They'd ripped my life apart, and they thought they'd get away with it. They thought I'd roll over and accept it, like I didn't matter. I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. For the next few days, I did nothing but plan. I had to be sure. I couldn't afford mistakes. There was too much at stake. My anger simmered, but I kept it under control. I kept my distance from Sarah, watching her closely while pretending nothing had changed. I didn't want her to know I was on to her. Not yet. I spent hours at night going through her phone bills, her emails, every scrap of information I could get my hands on. I pieced together her schedule, cross-referenced the nights she'd stayed out late with Michael's business trips and meetings. It all lined up too perfectly. She'd been seeing him for months, maybe longer. Each discovery felt like another knife twisting in my gut, but I forced myself to stay focused. I didn't sleep much. When I did, my dreams were filled with images of them together, laughing, touching, sneaking off to hotel rooms while I sat at home like an idiot. I woke up with my heart pounding, my fists clenched, drenched in sweat. One night, Sarah came home late, again. She didn't bother making up an excuse this time. She just muttered something about work, her eyes not meeting mine, and went straight to bed. I watched her from the doorway, the way she slipped out of her clothes and crawled under the sheets, like nothing was wrong. I clenched my jaw, every muscle in my body taut. I wanted to grab her, shake her, demand answers, but I didn't. She had no idea I was waiting for the right moment. That was what kept me calm. By the end of the week, I knew enough. I had the private investigators' reports, the photos, the records. It was time. I started putting the pieces together in my mind. How to destroy her and Michael both. It wouldn't be just about the affair. That was too small. No, I had to make sure their lives crumbled. Sarah's career, Michael's reputation, it all had to burn. The first step was figuring out Michael. I did my homework. The guy had been with his company for years, climbing the corporate ladder just like Sarah. His wealth wasn't just his salary, though. He had side deals, investments, things most people wouldn't see unless they looked closely. I looked closely. I found a few leads, shady real estate deals, offshore accounts. It didn't take long to uncover the dirt once I knew where to dig. Michael wasn't as smart as he thought. He'd cut corners, greased palms, moved money in ways that were bound to catch up with him. All I had to do was nudge things in the right direction, but I needed more than that. I needed someone on the inside. That's when Rachel reached out. It started with an email, just one line, no signature. I know, let's talk. At first, I thought it was a mistake, maybe some automated phishing scam. But there was something about it, something deliberate. I stared at the words, my heart racing, 1,000 thoughts running through my head. Had Michael found out I was digging into his affairs? Was he trying to scare me off? I ignored it, but then another one came a few hours later. This one had more detail. Michael's been lying to me too. I know who you are. I want to help. I realized who it was immediately. Rachel, his wife. I sat back, staring at the screen, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. She knew. Of course she did. I'd been so focused on Sarah and Michael, I hadn't considered how his wife might fit into all this. But Rachel was just as much a victim as I was, or maybe not. I called the private investigator again, had him look into Rachel. She wasn't some oblivious trophy wife. She was smart, sharp. She worked in finance, managing accounts for high-end clients. She wasn't the type to sit back while her husband ran around behind her back. No, she had her own agenda. The investigator confirmed that she'd been suspicious of Michael for a while. She'd hired her own people to watch him, just like I had. That meant she had leverage, resources, and access I didn't. It also meant I had to be careful. Rachel could be dangerous. Still, I needed her. She had information I couldn't get on my own, and if she wanted revenge as badly as I did, we could help each other. But I wasn't going to let her call the shots. I sent her a reply. Let's meet. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where no one would notice two strangers talking quietly in the back corner. Rachel was already there when I arrived, dressed in business casual, her dark hair pulled into a neat ponytail. She looked calm, controlled, but her eyes were sharp, taking everything in as I sat down across from her. Ethan, she said, nodding. Rachel. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. You said you know. She didn't waste any time. I know about Sarah, and I know about Michael. I've been following him for months. I have more on him than you can imagine. Her voice was cold, measured, but there was something underneath. A quiet fury, barely contained. She wasn't just angry. She was out for blood. Why reach out to me, I asked. What do you want? Rachel smirked, leaning in slightly. Because you're already halfway there. I've been watching you, Ethan. I know what you've been doing, digging into his business, looking for dirt. You want to take him down, and so do I. She paused, her eyes locking onto mine. But if we work together, we can do more than just ruin him. We can destroy him. I stayed silent, letting her words sink in. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? I wanted Michael's life to fall apart just like mine had. But there was something about Rachel, something that felt off. Her hatred for Michael was deeper than just the affair. She wanted to obliterate him, wipe him off the map. Still, I nodded. All right, what do you have in mind? She smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. Michael's not just a cheater, he's a criminal. I have proof. Financial records, documents he thought he buried. If we release them at the right time to the right people, he'll be finished. His whole career will collapse. And Sarah? I asked, my jaw tightening at the thought of her walking away unscathed. Rachel's eyes gleamed. She's been working with him on some of these deals. She's as guilty as he is. When this goes public, her name will be all over it. She won't just lose her job, she'll be blacklisted from every company in the industry. No one will touch her. I sat there processing everything she said. It was tempting, so tempting to just hand it all over to Rachel and let her pull the trigger. But something told me this was more than just revenge for her. Rachel wanted to ruin Michael in every way possible. I'm in, I said finally, keeping my voice steady. But we do this my way. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Your way? You might have the evidence, I said, leaning forward. But this is personal for me. Sarah, she's mine to deal with. I want to make sure she feels everything I've felt. Rachel didn't blink. She just nodded. Fine. As long as Michael goes down, I don't care how you handle her. The next few weeks were a blur of planning. Rachel and I coordinated carefully, making sure every piece was in place before we made our move. She handed over the documents, hundreds of pages detailing Michael's illegal activities. Offshore accounts, insider trading, embezzlement, it was all there just waiting to be exposed. I had Sarah's name all over some of those deals. She hadn't signed anything directly, but she'd been involved. Her emails, her recommendations, her meetings with clients, it was all there in the shadows, enough to ruin her career once the information came to light. We decided to leak the documents to the press first. A few anonymous tips, some well-timed emails to journalists who specialized in corporate crime. The stories started trickling out, first in the business section, then spreading to the national news. Headlines about Michael's company, whispers of investigations, SEC inquiries. Michael's world was starting to crumble, and Sarah had no idea she was about to be swept away with it. I kept my distance from her during those weeks. She'd grown more distant, spending even more nights away, her phone glued to her hand. She still didn't know that I knew. That was the part that kept me going, the knowledge that, when it hit, she wouldn't see it coming. It happened on a Thursday. The SEC launched a full investigation into Michael's company, and the news hit every major outlet by noon. I watched the coverage from my office, my heart pounding in my chest. Sarah hadn't called. She hadn't even texted. She was still at work, probably oblivious to the storm that was about to tear her life apart. I waited for her to come home that night, my body humming with adrenaline. This was the moment, the culmination of everything I'd been working for. Sarah walked through the door around 8 p.m., her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. What's wrong? I asked, playing dumb. She swallowed hard, her voice shaky. Michael's company. There's an investigation, something about financial misconduct. It's bad, Ethan, really bad. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch between us, my heart pounding. Are you involved? I asked, my voice low. Her eyes widened, and for a moment I saw it, the fear, the panic. She shook her head quickly, too quickly. No, Ethan, I don't know what's going on. I'm not. I cut her off, my voice cold. I know, Sarah. I know everything. Her face went white. Sarah's face went white as the realization hit her. I stood there staring at her, watching the panic settle in her eyes like a slow poison. She fumbled with her phone, her voice shaking. Ethan, I can explain. I cut her off, stepping closer, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. Explain what? That you've been fucking your boss? That you've been lying to me for months, maybe longer? Or that you thought I wouldn't find out? Her lips parted, but no words came. She was choking on them, her mind racing to come up with an excuse, a lie, something, anything that would make this all go away. But there was no lie that could fix this. I grabbed her phone out of her hand, tossing it onto the table. The sound of it clattering against the wood echoed through the silence. Sarah flinched, tears welling in her eyes. It's not what you think, she whispered, her voice cracking. Michael and it wasn't supposed to happen. It's just, don't, I snapped, cutting her off again. I didn't want to hear the excuses, the bullshit. I wanted her to feel what I'd felt, to understand the betrayal that had ripped through me like a knife. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for me, desperate now. Please, Ethan, we can fix this. I'll end it. I'll quit my job. We can go to counseling. I love you. I laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. Love me? You don't love me. You love what I gave you, a nice house, stability. You love the life I built for you while you were out fucking someone else. Her tears fell freely now, her makeup smudging, her face crumpling into something pathetic and desperate. But I didn't feel sorry for her, not anymore. The anger had swallowed whatever sympathy I might have had left. I turned away from her, pacing the length of the living room, my thoughts racing. This wasn't the confrontation I'd imagined. I thought I'd feel some sense of closure, some satisfaction in seeing her crumble. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. This was only the beginning. I'm going to ruin him, I said, my voice steady, controlled. Michael, I've already started. The SEC investigation. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah gasped, stumbling back, her hand flying to her mouth. You did that? I nodded. And your name's on those deals too. You're going down with him. She shook her head wildly, her face pale as she realized the full weight of what I was saying. No, Ethan, you can't. Please don't do this. Don't destroy me. I was wrong. I know I was wrong, but I'm begging you. Please. Her sobs grew louder, more frantic, but they didn't move me. Not anymore. I'd done my homework. I had Rachel's documents, the private investigators' reports, and Sarah's name linked to shady deals with Michael's company. The emails were there, the meetings, the signatures. She hadn't been just an innocent pawn in Michael's scheme. She was complicit, and when everything hit the fan, she would be blacklisted from the entire industry. Do you think I care? I turned to face her, my eyes narrowing. After everything you've done, you deserve this, Sarah. You and Michael both. Sarah dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands clutching at my pant leg, begging, pleading for me to stop. But I didn't flinch. I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen, what I'd gone through. This was the moment I had planned for. The culmination of all the sleepless nights, the rage, the humiliation. And now, it was time to watch them fall. Michael's fall from grace happened faster than I expected. Rachel and I had coordinated perfectly, releasing just enough information at key moments to send shockwaves through his company. The SEC had opened an investigation, but it didn't stop there. Insider trading, offshore accounts, and embezzlement, all of it was leaked to the media in waves, creating a perfect storm of scandal that left no room for him to maneuver. Within days, his face was plastered across every news outlet. The once respected CEO was now a pariah, his career in ruins. Sarah tried to reach out to him, but Michael was too busy trying to save his own skin. She called him night after night, but the calls went unanswered. I'd see her sitting at the kitchen table, her phone clutched in her hand, her face pale and drawn, waiting for a call that would never come. She hadn't been fired yet, not officially, but it was only a matter of time. Her company was starting to distance itself from the scandal, and when they finally figured out how deep she was in Michael's schemes, they'd cut her loose. And then, it happened. The night Sarah's career imploded, I was sitting in the living room, watching the news, pretending I didn't care. But I was waiting. The scandal had broken earlier that afternoon. Sarah's company had fired her, citing ethical concerns, in relation to her involvement with Michael's financial misdeeds. She came home late as usual. Her face was ashen, her eyes red from crying. She dropped her bag by the door and stood there staring at me, her body trembling. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They fired me, I didn't respond. I just kept watching the TV, the news anchor talking about the latest updates in Michael's scandal. Sarah's name was mentioned, but only in passing. She wasn't the main event, not yet. Sarah collapsed onto the couch next to me, her hands shaking as she buried her face in them, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, the sound of her sobs filling the room. And yet, it still wasn't enough. I thought I'd feel some sense of victory in this moment. I thought watching her lose everything would give me the closure I craved. But instead, I felt nothing. Just a hollow emptiness, a void that couldn't be filled by her tears or her desperation. I stood up, walking out of the room, leaving her to cry alone. Michael was next. With his career in tatters, the media frenzy around him grew more vicious by the day. Every new revelation only fueled the fire. His company collapsed under the weight of the scandal, and his personal life wasn't far behind. Rachel played her part perfectly. She leaked more documents, more evidence of his betrayal, not just financial, but personal, affairs, lies. Everything he'd hidden over the years came spilling out into the public eye, and there was no escaping it. But Rachel wasn't satisfied with just destroying his career. She wanted more. One night she called me. Her voice was calm, but there was a coldness in it that made my stomach twist. "I want him ruined, Ethan," she said, her words measured. "Completely. He can't just walk away from this with his life intact. He needs to suffer." I paused, unsure of where she was going with this. "He's already lost everything, Rachel. His career, his reputation." "Not enough," she snapped. "He deserves more than that. He deserves to lose everything. I want him humiliated, broken." I didn't like the edge in her voice. I'd wanted revenge, yes, but Rachel's hatred ran deeper. It was darker, more obsessive. "What are you planning?" I asked, my voice low. There was a brief silence on the other end before she responded, her tone icy. "You'll see." I should have walked away right then. I should have known that Rachel's obsession with Michael would only lead to something worse, but I didn't. The next day, a video leaked. Michael, drunk and disheveled, stumbling out of a bar with another woman. It was clear he was in bad shape. His face bruised, his clothes dirty. He slurred his words, shouting at the woman, making a scene as people filmed him with their phones. It went viral almost instantly. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the rumors that followed. People started talking about the women he'd been with, about the fights, the drugs, the violence. It didn't matter if all of it was true or not. His image was already shattered, and now there was nothing left to salvage. Rachel had destroyed him, just like she said she would. But it wasn't just Michael who was ruined. Sarah, once a respected figure in her industry, was blacklisted. No one would hire her. Her friends stopped returning her calls. The life she had built was gone, crumbled to ash in a matter of weeks. I sat alone in the quiet of my house, the silence pressing down on me. Everything I'd wanted, everything I'd worked for, had happened. Michael was ruined. Sarah was out of my life. And yet, as I stared at the empty space where Sarah's things used to be, I felt nothing. No joy, no victory. Just an overwhelming sense of emptiness. I thought revenge would bring me peace. I thought destroying them would make me whole again. But all it did was leave me standing in the wreckage of a life I no longer recognized. Sarah was gone. Michael was a shell of a man, and Rachel had become a monster in her own right. I should have walked away, but it was too late now. Sarah had been gone for 2 days. She left behind a hollow, suffocating silence, but I barely noticed. My mind was still stuck on the aftermath, replaying every step, every moment of her collapse. The last conversation we had echoed in my head, her voice shaking, desperate, begging me to stop. I had ignored her then, turned my back as she broke down. Now she was out of the house, her belongings packed into a few boxes, gone like she had never been part of my life at all. But even with her absence, there was no sense of finality, no closure. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished, that I'd ripped apart everything and left myself standing in the ruins. It didn't take long for the real consequences to start unraveling. On the third day, Sarah called me. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice raw and strained. "Ethan, please. I know you hate me, but I don't know what to do. I need help. Everything's falling apart. No one's returning my calls, and I deleted the message without listening to the rest. I didn't need to hear it. I already knew what she wanted. She was drowning. Her professional life was over. Her social circle had cut her off, and Michael wasn't there to save her anymore. She was reaching for me, trying to hold on to the one thing that had once been stable in her life, me. But I wasn't her lifeline anymore. I had made sure of that. Still, after I deleted the message, a strange heaviness settled over me. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't even anger anymore. It was just emptiness. I sat there staring at my phone, waiting for something. Maybe another message. Maybe a sign that this was over. But it never came. The days stretched on, and Sarah kept calling. Her voice grew more frantic with each message, more desperate, but I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to hear her admit defeat, to crawl back asking for forgiveness. The truth was, I didn't care anymore. What would an apology even mean now? She was shattered, and I was the one who had broken her. But as her pleas intensified, something in me started to shift. I hadn't expected this, a sense of unease creeping up on me, as if the revenge I had so meticulously planned was unraveling right before my eyes. Michael wasn't faring any better. After Rachel leaked the video of him, his downward spiral became public spectacle. The media picked apart every detail of his ruined life, his drunken outbursts, the affair with Sarah, the financial crimes. There were rumors that he'd been checked into rehab after a particularly public meltdown. It was everything Rachel had wanted. She had ripped him apart in every conceivable way. But it wasn't enough for her. I had distanced myself from Rachel after the video leaked. Her obsession with Michael had taken on a life of its own, something dark and uncontrollable. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about complete annihilation. And watching her go after him again and again, it dawned on me that she didn't care about the collateral damage. Sarah, me, none of it mattered. Rachel just wanted blood. One night, Rachel called me again. I hadn't spoken to her since the video went viral, and I hesitated before answering. I already knew what she wanted, what she was going to say. "Ethan," she began, her voice cold and sharp, "we need to finish this." "It's finished," I said, keeping my tone neutral, though my stomach churned. "Michael's done. You got what you wanted." "Not everything," she replied. "He's still out there. He's still walking around like he has some kind of dignity left. After everything he's done, he shouldn't be able to rebuild his life." I swallowed hard, the realization hitting me. Rachel wanted more than destruction. She wanted to bury him for good. There was no line she wouldn't cross. "I'm out," I said firm. "I'm done with this." Rachel's voice dropped into something darker, more dangerous. "You can't walk away now, Ethan. You're as deep in this as I am. You wanted this just as much as I did." "No," I said, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. "I wanted him ruined, and he's ruined, but I'm not crossing that line." Rachel was silent for a moment, and then her voice softened, almost pleading. "Don't be naive. Michael's not done. He'll come back. People like him always do. And when he does, he'll remember that you were part of this." I hung up before she could finish, but the words stuck with me. Michael, coming back. It was possible, wasn't it? He'd lost everything, but he had money, connections. What if he clawed his way back? What if he rebuilt his life from the ashes? I pushed the thought away, trying to focus on the present. I had what I wanted. Sarah was gone, Michael was destroyed, and Rachel was spiraling into her own obsession. It wasn't my problem anymore. But it didn't feel that way. The real unraveling started 2 weeks later. Sarah showed up at the house, unannounced. I hadn't seen her since she left, and when I opened the door, I barely recognized the woman standing in front of me. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes rumpled. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. "Ethan," she said, her voice weak, "please, I don't know where else to go." I didn't respond, just stared at her, unsure of what to say. They've taken everything from me, she continued, her eyes hollow. I can't get a job. My friends won't talk to me. Michael's disappeared and I'm lost. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. You did this to yourself, Sarah. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know I deserve it. But I never thought it would be like this. I thought, she broke off, her voice cracking. I thought you would at least. At least what? I snapped, the anger flaring up again. Forgive you? Let you back into my life after everything you've done? Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to come back. I just don't know what to do. There it was. The admission. She was broken. Everything she had built, everything she had taken from me was gone. And now she stood there begging for scraps of mercy. But I had none left to give. You'll figure it out, I said, my voice cold, just like I did. I shut the door in her face. As I stood there listening to her soft sobs on the other side, I felt no relief, no closure. The silence that followed was suffocating, and for the first time, I wondered if this was all I would be left with, this empty house, this heavy silence, and a broken woman crying on my doorstep. Rachel, true to her word, wasn't done with Michael. I read about it in the papers. Another scandal, this time more personal, more humiliating. A leaked audio tape, one that exposed Michael in a vulnerable, desperate moment. Rachel's fingerprints were all over it, and when I heard about it, I felt a pang of guilt. I had let her get this far. I had been complicit. Michael had spiraled even further. The last I heard, he had checked into a rehab facility. His life was in tatters, but somehow, Rachel wasn't satisfied. She kept digging, kept leaking, as if she couldn't stop herself. I watched from a distance, realizing that Rachel had become the very thing we had both hated. She had destroyed Michael, but in the process, she had destroyed herself too. And if I wasn't careful, I would end up just like her. The day I saw Rachel for the last time, I knew it had gone too far. I was walking down the street, lost in thought, when I spotted her sitting alone at a cafe, staring blankly at her phone. Her face was gaunt, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She looked like a ghost of the woman I had met weeks ago. The woman who had seemed so in control, so calculated, had been consumed by her need for revenge. She didn't see me, but I didn't approach her. I didn't need to. I had seen enough. I walked away, leaving Rachel to her obsession, realizing that I had come dangerously close to following the same path. But unlike her, I still had a chance to stop. In the end, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I had won anything. The revenge I had sought, the destruction I had orchestrated, had left me with nothing but a hollow emptiness. I had ruined Sarah, destroyed Michael, but the satisfaction I thought would come never materialized. Instead, I stood in the wreckage of my own life, wondering if I had gone too far. There was no going back now, no undoing the damage I had caused, not just to them, but to myself. I sat alone in the quiet house, the weight of it pressing down on me. Sarah was gone for good this time. She had moved out earlier that morning, taking the last of her things. The house felt empty, but not just physically. It felt like something deeper had been hollowed out. The satisfaction I had once imagined, the vision of standing victorious over the ruins of her life and Michael's, had vanished like smoke. Instead, all I felt was the ache of what had been destroyed, what I had destroyed. I had taken everything from her, from him, from both of them. And yet, sitting there in the silence, I wondered if I'd taken something from myself, too. The house still smelled faintly of Sarah's perfume, a sharp reminder of the life we'd once shared. I had spent years building this home, this marriage, this sense of stability. And with one decision, with one relentless pursuit of revenge, I had torn it all apart. I had thought that when this was over, I'd feel whole again, that the hole Sarah's betrayal had carved in me would be filled by her suffering. But there was no wholeness, no sense of completion. I was left staring into the same abyss that had been there the night I'd followed her to that hotel. It hit me then, the truth I'd been avoiding. The revenge wasn't about justice. It was never going to heal the wounds Sarah's affair had left behind. Instead, It had turned me into something unrecognizable, a man I didn't know anymore. I had let the betrayal define me, let the hatred fester and grow until it consumed everything in its path. I had destroyed Michael. His career was over, his reputation shattered, but that wasn't the worst of it. Rachel's last move, the video leak, had ensured he would never rebuild his life. I hadn't seen it coming, hadn't realized how far Rachel would go. But when I watched it unfold from a distance, a cold dread settled in my chest. I had been a part of that. I had let Rachel turn into a monster, and in doing so, I had become complicit in the destruction of a man's life, not just his career, but his very existence. I could still hear her voice from that last phone call, the venom in her words as she said, "It's not enough. He needs to be erased." Rachel had crossed a line I couldn't follow her over. She had become consumed by the same obsession that had driven me, but where I had pulled back, she had kept going, devouring everything in her path. She had become a mirror of everything I feared I could be if I let this hate consume me any further. And then there was Sarah. I had destroyed her too, hadn't I? It wasn't just about the affair. It was about more than that. The humiliation, the betrayal, the way she had made me feel like nothing. I had wanted her to understand the pain she had caused, to feel it as deeply as I had, but I had gone too far. I hadn't just wanted her to hurt, I had wanted her to lose everything, and she had. Her job was gone, her reputation blacklisted in the industry. She had no friends left, no one who would return her calls. She had stood on my doorstep, broken, begging me for some kind of help, for forgiveness maybe, but I couldn't offer it, not then. But now, as I sat in the silence of the home we had once shared, I wasn't sure if I could forgive myself. A week later, I found myself in a therapist's office. It wasn't something I'd ever imagined I'd do, talking to a stranger about my feelings, my regrets. But after everything, I couldn't ignore the emptiness any longer. I needed to understand what had happened to me, how I had let myself become this version of Ethan, the one who had torn two lives apart and had nothing left to show for it. The therapist, Dr. Harris, was calm, steady. He didn't rush me, didn't push me to talk. He just waited until I was ready. "I thought it would fix everything," I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I thought if I destroyed them, if I made them suffer the way I had, it would make things right again. But it didn't. It just left me here." Dr. Harris nodded. "Revenge rarely brings the closure people expect. It's like drinking poison and hoping it kills the other person." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. I had heard the phrase before, but hearing it now, in this context, felt different. I had swallowed that poison. I had let it fester inside me, thinking it would heal the wounds Sarah's betrayal had opened. But all it had done was spread, like a sickness I hadn't seen until it was too late. "Do you regret it?" Dr. Harris asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but the truth was more complicated than a simple yes or no. I didn't regret taking action. I didn't regret standing up for myself, refusing to be the victim. But I regretted how far I had gone, how I had lost sight of myself in the process. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me thinks maybe this was the only way, but another part wonders if I've just made things worse." Dr. Harris leaned forward, his gaze steady. "The important thing is that you're asking yourself those questions now. It means you're not stuck in the cycle. You're starting to break free from it." The weeks that followed were quieter. I kept going to therapy, talking through the mess I had created, trying to make sense of it. Slowly, I began to understand that the revenge I had so meticulously planned hadn't been about justice at all. It had been about control, about taking back something I had felt Sarah had stolen from me. But control, like revenge, was an illusion. It didn't bring peace. It didn't fix what had been broken. It just left me standing in the rubble trying to figure out how to rebuild. Sarah had moved to another city. I hadn't heard from her since that last time on my doorstep. She had reached out a few more times, left a couple of voicemails I couldn't bring myself to delete, but I hadn't responded. I didn't know if I ever would. Michael had vanished from the public eye. The last rumor I heard was that he had left the country trying to escape the fallout. Rachel, on the other hand, had disappeared into her obsession. I hadn't seen or heard from her since that day at the cafe, but I knew she wouldn't stop until she had destroyed every last piece of Michael's life. She was lost now, just like I had almost been. One night, I found myself walking through the empty rooms of my house, the rooms that had once been filled with Sarah's presence, with the life we had built together. I passed the living room, where we had spent so many quiet nights watching movies. The kitchen, where we had shared meals, laughed over burnt dinners. The bedroom, where I had once felt safe, loved. But it wasn't my home anymore. Not really. It was just a place I lived in, a shell of what it had once been. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, staring at the bed that now felt too big, too empty. The weight of it all pressed down on me, the betrayal, the anger, the revenge. I had carried it for so long, let it shape me, consume me. But now, standing there in the quiet, I realized I couldn't carry it anymore. I couldn't change what had happened. I couldn't undo the choices I had made, but I could try to move forward, to rebuild, not from a place of anger, but from something else, something quieter. Something that didn't demand destruction. The next morning, I called a real estate agent. I needed to leave the house, leave the memories behind. It wasn't about running away, it was about starting over, finding a place where I could build something new, something that wasn't tied to the past. As I walked through the empty rooms one last time, I felt the faintest sense of relief, like a weight had finally started to lift. It wasn't gone, not completely. I knew the scars would stay with me, that the pain wouldn't disappear overnight, but it was a start. I stepped out into the crisp morning air, locking the door behind me. For the first time in a long time, I felt something like hope. Not for revenge, not for retribution, but for myself. For the possibility of something better, something more than the darkness I had lived in for so long. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew I wasn't the man I had been when this all started. I wasn't consumed by the need to destroy anymore. I wasn't Rachel, and I wasn't Michael. I was just Ethan. And that, for now, was enough.